Hello and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Last time we read Book 6 in the George and Martha series by James Marshall, and now we have come to the last book he wrote of George and Martha. So I won't waste any time chatting as usual. So here we go. From 1988, George and Martha, Book 7, George and Martha, Round and Round. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Five stories about the best of friends. Story number 1. The Clock. George gave Martha a present for her birthday. "It's a cuckoo clock," said George. "So I see," said Martha. "It's nice and loud," said George. "So I hear," said Martha. "Do you like it?" asked George. "Oh, yes, indeed," said Martha. But to tell you the truth, the cuckoo clock actually got on Martha's nerves. I notice this particular cuckoo clock doesn't have a pendulum underneath. How strange indeed. The next day George went to Martha's house. Martha was not at home, and the cuckoo clock was not on the wall. "Maybe she likes it so much she took it with her," said George. Just then he heard a faint cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo. To George's surprise, the cuckoo clock was at the bottom of Martha's laundry basket. When Martha returned, she couldn't look George in the eye. "It must have fallen in by mistake," she said. "I hope it isn't broken." "Not at all," said George. "The paint isn't even chipped. The clock works just dandy, and the cuckoo hasn't lost its splendid voice." "Would you like to borrow it?" asked Martha. George was delighted. He found just the right spot for it, too. "Wasn't that considerate of Martha to lend me her clock?" thought George. "Cuckoo," said the clock. "I bet she wants him to keep it for good." Story number 2. The Trip. George invited Martha on an ocean cruise. "This is just a river." "Is this the boat?" said Martha. "Use your imagination," said George. "I'll try," said Martha. Very soon it was raining cats and dogs. "This is unpleasant," said Martha. "Use your imagination," said George. "Think of it as a thrilling storm at sea." "I'll try," said Martha. "Lunch is served," said George, and he gave Martha a soggy cracker. Martha was not impressed. "Use your imagination," said George. "Oh, looky," said Martha. "What a pretty shark." "A shark!" cried George. George took a spill. "But where's the shark?" he said. "Really," said Martha, "you must learn to use your imagination." You use his own words against him. Story number 3. The Artist. George was painting in oils. "The ocean doesn't look right," said Martha. "Add some more blue, and that sand looks all wrong. Add a bit more yellow." "Please," said George, "artists don't like interference." But Martha just couldn't help herself. "Those palm trees look so funny," she said. "That does it," said George. "See if you can do better." And he went off in a huff. My, said Martha, "some artists are so touchy. You were the one who kept on bugging him." And she began to make a few small improvements. "Doesn't look like a few to me." Aha! When George returned, Martha proudly displayed the painting. George was flabbergasted. "You've ruined it," he cried. "I'm sorry you feel that way," said Martha. "I like it." Martha was one of those artists who aren't a bit touchy. Story number 4. The Attic. One cold and stormy night, George decided to peek into the attic. "Go on up," said Martha. "Oh, no," said George. "There might be a ghost up there, or a skeleton, or a vampire, or maybe even some werewolves." Oh, goody, said Martha. Let's investigate. But there wasn't much to see in the attic. Only a box of old rubber bands. George was disappointed. Would you like to hear a story that will give you goosebumps? Asked Martha. You bet, said George. When you hear it, your bones will go cold, said Martha. Ooh, said George. Your blood will curdle, said Martha. Ooh, said George. And you'll feel mummy fingers up and down your spine, said Martha. Stop, cried George. I can't take any more. Tell me some other time. That night, Martha went to bed with the light on. She had a bad case of goosebumps. And now the last story. The surprise. One late summer morning, George had a wicked idea. I shouldn't, he said. I really shouldn't. But he just couldn't help himself. Here comes the rain, he cried. Egads! Screamed Martha. Martha was thoroughly drenched and as mad as a wet hen. I thought the term was mad as a March hare. Oh wait, that's the other term for mad. That did it, she said. We are no longer on speaking terms. I was only horsing around, said George, but Martha was unmoved. The next morning, Martha had read a funny story. I can't wait to tell George, she said. Then she remembered that she and George were no longer on speaking terms. Around noon, Martha heard a joke on the radio. George will love this one, she said. But she and George weren't speaking. In the afternoon, Martha observed the first autumn leaf fall to the ground. Autumn is George's favorite season, she said. Another leaf came swirling down. That does it, said Martha. Martha went straight to George's house. I forgive you, she said. George was delighted to be back on speaking terms. Good friends just can't stay cross for long, said George. You can say that again, said Martha. And together they watched the autumn arrive. But when summer rolled around again, Martha was ready and waiting. The end. And that concludes the book series of George and Martha by the late great James Marshall. He probably would have written more if he hadn't died suddenly in 1992 at the age of 50. But his books live on with the next generation. And in 1999, a cartoon series of the George and Martha series, simply called George and Martha, premiered, featuring the voices of Nathan Lane as George and Andrea Martin as Martha. I never actually seen the series, but I heard it was pretty funny, and they really expanded upon all the short stories in James Marshall's works. Well, I recommend checking out the cartoon series, and feel free to do your own read aloud of George and Martha, and listen to what people have to say about it. I really enjoyed reading these books, and I'll see you all again next time on Storytime with Eric Zimmer.